Good morning, children. Today we shall continue with the story Hitch Hiker. The story in a nutshell till now. The author, Roald Dahl, was traveling all alone to London in his big new BMW car. It was the month of June. As he headed towards London, he saw a man standing beside the road, thumbing for a lift. He brought his car to a halt and asked the hitchhiker to hop in. While they moved on, the driver asked his passenger a number of questions, which he did not seem to like. The author discloses to him that he is a writer by profession, and thus the curiosity within him forces him to ask questions from his passengers. The hitchhiker became very friendly and praised him for being in a skilled profession. He even praised his car that he owned and asked the author to prove the top speed of the car. The author, trying to impress his passenger, pressed the accelerator, and soon they were moving at the speed of 120 miles per hour. As both of them were enjoying their ride, they heard the siren of the police. The author realized that he was now in trouble. The policeman brought them to a halt and asked them that why were they speeding. The author had no words. He had nothing to say. Let us see what happens next. The policeman continued to cross-question the author. And when he spoke next, he spoke so loudly that the author jumped. He was taken aback. The policeman told him that he drove at a speed of 120 miles per hour. That was 50 miles an hour over the limit in the area. Then the policeman looked towards the passenger, that is the hitchhiker, and asked him, "Who are you?" The hitchhiker kept quiet, but the author immediately responded. He said, "He's a hitchhiker. I'm giving him a lift." The policeman, in an angry manner, looked towards the author and said, "I didn't ask you. I asked him." The hitchhiker became very calm and quiet, and in a soft voice he said, "Have I done something wrong?" His voice was as soft and oily as hair cream. The policeman said, "That's more than likely, but you're going to be my witness to the overspeeding that the author had been caught for." But he told him that he would deal with him a minute later and asked the author for his driving license. The author took out his driving license and gave it to the policeman. To record the details of the author, the policeman unbuttoned the left-hand breast pocket of his tunic and brought out the dreaded book of tickets. Here, the dreaded book of tickets are the challan books. Carefully, he copied the name and address from my license, from the author's license. Then he gave it back to me, to the author. He strolled around to the front of the car and read the number from the number plate and wrote down as well. He noted the same in his diary, in his book. He filled in the date and time and the details of my offense, of the mistake that the author had committed. Then he tore out the copy of the ticket of the challan. Finally, he replaced the book in his tunic pocket and fastened the button. "Now you," he said to my passenger, to the hitchhiker, and he walked around the other side of the car and asked his name. Michael Fish, my passenger answered. Then he asked for his address, for which the passenger replied, 14 Windsor Lane, Luton. Show me something to prove that this is your real name and address, the policeman asked the hitchhiker, for he did not seem to believe him. When the policeman did not believe the hitchhiker, my passenger fished in his pockets. He searched in his pockets and came out with a driving license of his own. The policeman checked his name and address and handed it back to him. Then he further asked him, "What's your job?" The policeman asked the hitchhiker. "I am an odd carrier." "And what's a odd carrier, may I ask?" the policeman asked. The hitchhiker replied, "An odd carrier officer is a person who carries the cement up the ladder to the bricklayer, where the mason lays the bricks. And the odd is what he carries it in. It's got a long handle, and on top of you got two bits of wood set at an angle." The policeman wrote all this down in the black notebook. Then he returned the book to his pocket and did up the button. That means he fastened the button of his tunic. After noting down all the details of the hitchhiker, the policeman once again approached the author and told him, "You won't be driving this fancy car of yours again for a very long time, not after we have finished with you. Once your crime has been proved, you would not be able to drive this car for a long time." And he even told him, "I hope they lock you up for a spell into the bargain, and I wish they lock you up for the mistake that you have made." At that moment, the author was alarmed and he asked the policeman, "You mean prison?" He replied, "Absolutely, in the clink, in the prison, along with all the criminals who break the law, and a hefty fine into the bargain." He also tells him that he might have to pay a heavy fine for the same. Then the policeman turned away and walked over to his motorcycle. Then he kicked the starter and roared off up the road out of sight. Once the policeman was gone, the author breathed with a sigh. "Phew, that's done it." "We was caught," my passenger said. "We was caught good and proper." And now the hitchhiker shouted that they had been caught red-handed by the policeman. The author was a bit disappointed and he said, "I was caught, you mean? You mean that I was caught?" "That's right," he said. "What are you going to do now, Governor?" And he asked the author that what was he going to do now? How was he going to get out of this trouble? On being questioned by the hitchhiker, the author replied that he was going straight up to London to talk to his solicitor, to his lawyer. And then he started his car and drove on towards London. "You mustn't believe what he said to you about going to prison," my passenger said. The hitchhiker said that the author must not believe every word of the policeman which he declared about going to prison. He also told him they don't put nobody in clink just for speeding. They don't put everyone behind the bars in the prison for just speeding. At that moment, the author felt tremendously relieved. He was greatly relieved. "By the way," I said, "you told him you were an unemployed odd carrier, but you told me you were in a highly skilled trade." The author was immediately reminded about the words of Hitchhiker and asked him Why did he tell the policeman that he was unemployed hod carrier, whereas he had told him that he belonged to a skilled profession? The hitchhiker said that he still belonged to a skilled trade, but it was not necessary that he tells everything to a cooper, to a policeman. As the author became curious to know about the hitchhiker, he asked him, "So what do you do?" And he replied, "I'm in a very peculiar trade, very special trade. I'm in the queerest trade of them all. I'm in one of the finest trade of all." The author waited for him to continue to speak. The hitchhiker sat back and smiled. "I've got fantastic fingers," he said, holding up both his hands. The author glanced towards his fingers. He looked towards his fingers. When he looked, he saw they were so beautifully shaped, so slim and long and elegant, that they did not seem to belong to the rest of him at all. They looked more like the fingers of a brain surgeon or a watchmaker. The fingers of the hitchhiker did not coordinate with the rest of his appearance. As the author wanted to know about the profession of the hitchhiker, he executes the same and shows to the author. Suddenly, my passenger was holding a black leather belt in his hand. Here, my passenger refers to the hitchhiker. He had a black leather belt in his hand. "Ever seen this before?" he asked author. The belt had a buckle of an unusual design. On seeing the belt, the author said, "Hey, that's mine, isn't it?" "It is mine. Where did you get it?" The hitchhiker grinned and waved the belt gently from one side to another. "Off the top of your trousers, of course," he said. "You mean you took it off me while we have been driving along?" I asked, flabbergasted. The author was shocked, was taken aback, and could not believe that the hitchhiker had taken off his belt while he was driving. He nodded. He shook his head, watching me all the time with those ratty eyes. He dropped the belt on his lap, and now all at once there was a brown shoelace dangling from his fingers, hanging within his fingers. "And what about this then?" he exclaimed, waving the shoelace. The author glanced down at his shoe. The lace of one of them was missing. "Good grief," I said, the author said. "How did you do that? I never saw you bending down." The author could not believe his eyes, for he did not even see the hitchhiker bending down. The hitchhiker said, "You never saw nothing," he said proudly. He was very proud of himself, for he was able to perform his tricks efficiently. And he told the author, "You never even saw me move an inch. You did not even see me moving an inch. And you know why? And do you realize why?" And the author replied, "Yes, because you have got fantastic fingers." And now he says, "I understand. Why did you say that you have fantastic fingers?" At that moment, the hitchhiker replied, "Exactly right." He sat back and smiled, for he knew he had impressed me greatly, the author greatly, with those two tricks, and this made him very happy. "I don't want to be late," he said. "What time is it?" Suddenly, the hitchhiker asked what time it was from the driver. I hitched up my sleeve to look at the watch on my wrist. The author pulled up his sleeve to see what time was it on his watch. It wasn't there. The watch was missing. I looked at the man. The author looked at the hitchhiker. He looked back at me, grinning, smiling. The author said, "You have taken that too?" He held out his hand, and there was my watch lying in his palm. He placed the watch carefully on the leather tray in front of him. After that, he said, "I won't nick anything from you, Governor. I won't take anything away from you, Governor. You're my pal, you're my friend. You're giving me a lift." He told the author that he would not steal anything from him. He would not take away any of his precious things, as he was his friend who was giving him lift. The author was extremely happy to hear that the hitchhiker considered him his friend. The hitchhiker continued to say, "All I'm doing is answering your questions. I'm just trying to answer the questions that you had put forth. You asked me what I did for my living, and I'm showing you." At that moment, the author asked the hitchhiker, "What else have you got of mine?" The hitchhiker smiled again, and now started taking from the pockets of his jacket one thing after another that belonged to me, to the author. My driving license, a keyring with 4 keys on it, some pound notes, a letter from my publisher, my diary, a stubby old pencil, and last of all, a beautiful old spy ring with pearls around it belonging to my wife. The author was taking the ring up to the jeweler in London because one of the pearls was missing. The hitchhiker put the ring on the leather tray with other items. The author said, "So you are a pickpocket." At that moment, the hitchhiker replied, "I don't like that word. It's a vulgar word. It's a bad word. Pickpockets are coarse and vulgar people. They're small people. They lift money from blind old ladies." The author became curious and asked the hitchhiker, "What do you call yourself then?" The hitchhiker replied, "Me? I am a fingersmith. I am a professional fingersmith." He spoke the words solemnly and proudly, seriously and proudly, as though he were telling me he was an Archbishop of Canterbury. "I have never heard that word before," the author said. "Did you invent it?" The hitchhiker replied, "Of course I didn't invent it. It's a name given to them who've risen to the very top of the profession. You have heard of goldsmith and silversmith, for instance. They are expert with gold and silver. I am an expert with my fingers, so I am a fingersmith." When the author asked him that why did he call himself a fingersmith, at that moment he replied, as he had risen to the topmost level of the profession, therefore he was an expert with his fingers, and thus called himself a fingersmith. On hearing the words of Hitchhiker, the author tries to correlate his visit to Epsom. He says, "And that's why you go to races?" At that moment he replied, "Race meetings are good. You just stand around after the race watching for the lucky ones to queue up and draw their money. And when you see someone collecting a big bundle of notes, you simply follow after him and help yourself. But don't get me wrong, Governor. I never take nothing from a loser, nor from a poor people neither. The hitchhiker tells that he does take away money from the lucky ones who are rich, but he does not take away money from losers or people those who are poor. On hearing the words of the hitchhiker, the author said, "That's very thoughtful of you," and asked him, "How often do you get caught?" The hitchhiker was a little disappointed by the author's words. "Caught? Me get caught? It's only pickpockets get caught. Fingersmiths never." Both of them drove on for a while. "That policeman's going to check up on you pretty thoroughly," I said. The author told the hitchhiker, "The policeman has noted down everything, and he is going to check the details of the hitchhiker very carefully. Doesn't that worry you a bit? Wasn't he worried about it?" The hitchhiker replied, "Nobody's checking up on me." "Of course they are. He's got your name and address written down most carefully in his black book." The author said that the policeman would surely check upon the hitchhiker, for he had written down his details very carefully in his black book. The man gave me another of his ratty little smiles. "Ah," he said, "so he has. But I bet he ain't got it all written down in his memory as well. He says he did write it down in his books, but he cannot remember every detail of it. I have never known a cooper yet with a decent memory. I have never come across a policeman who has good memory. Some of them can't even remember their own names, and some of them are so bad at memorizing that they forget their own names." At that moment, the author was a bit curious, and he asked the hitchhiker, "What's memory got to do with it? It's written down in his book, isn't it?" The hitchhiker replied, "Yes, Governor, it is. Yes, he did write in a book. But the problem is, he's lost the books. The policeman has lost both the books. He's lost both the books, the one with my name in it and the one with yours." In the long, delicate fingers of his hand, the man, that is the hitchhiker, was holding up in triumph the two books he had taken from the policeman's pocket. "Easiest job I ever done," he announced proudly. He told the author in a proud manner this was one of the easiest things that he had ever done. The author was so excited that he nearly swerved the car into the milk truck. He nearly banged the car into the milk truck. He shouted loudly, "You are a genius!" The hitchhiker told the author, "I think you did better pull in off this main road as soon as possible. It would be better for them to move aside from this main road. Then we did better build a little bonfire and burn these books." And he also advised the author to build a small bonfire, light a small bonfire to burn the books which were the evidence of their crime. At that moment, the author exclaimed, "You are a fantastic fellow." The hitchhiker replied, "Thank you, Governor. It's always nice to be appreciated." He loved being praised for the work that he did. After reading the story, let us now analyze the theme of the story. The story explores themes of class and the types of jobs performed. The narrator's skilled trade is writing, which is evident from the car that he rides, that is a BMW. With the passage of time, he has really become a great writer. The hitchhiker is a kind of a pickpocket. This isn't a typical skilled trade, but the kind of performance level that he displays makes it a skilled trade, and he too becomes very good at it. Another theme that is explored in the story is crime and punishment, which are controlled by authorities. The police officer, who is not very polite to the narrator and the hitchhiker, knows that he has caught them red-handed. He enjoys throwing around his weight because he knows that he has the authority in the situation. But what he does not know is that the hitchhiker is a skilled fingersmith who takes away the notepads from his pocket without his knowledge. The story shows that the ones with the authority sometimes bully those beneath them. In the story Hitchhiker, Roald Dahl very beautifully describes the car that he owns. He has a big new BMW car which could run at the speed of 129 miles per hour. Its body was pale blue in color, and the seats were dark blue, which were made of genuine soft leather. The windows and sunroof were electrically operated. It had a radio aerial which popped up and down on the click of a button. The powerful engine of the car growled and grunted at slow speed, but the car moved smoothly after 60 miles per hour. Roald Dahl very beautifully describes the hitchhiker. He says, "He was a small man with ratty face, with grey teeth. His eyes were dark and quick like that of rat's eyes, and his ears were slightly pointed at the top. He was wearing a cloth cap and a grey colored jacket with big pockets. All this, that is, the grey jacket with quick eyes and pointed ears, made him look like a huge human rat. He had slim, long, elegant fingers which did not seem to belong to the rest of his body. They rather seemed to be the fingers of a brain surgeon or a watchmaker. The hitchhiker was a great observer, as he identified that the author was a great writer, as he could possess a big car like BMW.